Hello everyone, DarkOfAllTrades here. Now it's been a bit since I covered morality and more than just touching on the idea. While I think I covered it quite well, there was a specific idea that I had not gone much into. Fortunately, if the first 2 seconds of the video I'm responding to today is any indication, I will get to really sink my teeth into the idea today. I could do a whole series of responses just on the channel for today's video, that is, Answers in AiG Canadialand. If there is one thing they do well, it is put out content, and specifically content rife with opportunities for response content. Now, I don't particularly want to be specifically associated with taking on AIG's content, but it is often tough to not respond to such blatant incorrect information. So what information am I unable to withstand correcting today? The title of today's video is, Why Atheists Can't Believe Murder is Wrong. In the title alone we have an issue. Wrong refers to correctness or truth, and or justice, honesty, or morality. I'm going to guess that Calvin is going to specifically refer to the moral aspect for this video. Murder, however, is a legal term. It is an unlawful act of taking another's life with premeditation. Simply killing another being is not necessarily murder. It can be, but it is not always. There are many situations where killing another being is legal. There are even times where premeditated killing of another person is legal. I'm willing to bet my audience is smart enough to find examples of these. Not everything that is unlawful is also immoral. Laws are not always based on morality. We already have a conflict within the title, or specifically a lack of conflict with these two terms. But maybe Calvin has a good argument, and I'm only 2 seconds in as of writing this, so let's see his full argument.
And are there such a thing as moral absolutes?
No, there isn't. Well, that isn't quite fair of me to say just yet. First, we need to understand what moral absolutes are. If moral absolutes were to exist, they would represent a set of universally applicable and unchanging principles that dictate what is inherently right or wrong, independent of cultural, societal, or individual beliefs. These absolutes would provide a clear and objective foundation for ethical decision-making, serving as a moral compass for individuals and societies alike. Moral absolutes might include fundamental principles such as prohibition of actions like murder, torture, and genocide, while also encompassing positive values like honesty, empathy, and respect for human dignity. The presence of moral absolutes would imply a shared moral framework that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries, offering a common ethical ground upon which individuals and societies could base their moral judgments and actions. On the surface, this could make intuitive sense. I typically take a moral objectivist perspective. I argue that while there may not be universally fixed and unchanging moral truths applicable to all circumstances, there are still objective moral principles that serve as valuable guides for ethical decision-making. Moral objectivism suggests that these principles are grounded in the well-being and interest of individuals and communities, allowing for a degree of objectivity in moral judgments. These principles may be context-dependent and subject to refinement as our understanding of human nature and societal dynamics evolves. In this view, morality is not rigidly absolute, but is rooted in objective considerations of human welfare and flourishing, allowing for flexibility and adaptation while still maintaining a framework for making morally informed choices. To be very clear, there are likely no realistic circumstances where certain actions are morally justified. Genocide is an excellent example. I am sure I could think of some very outlandish situation, such as a cataclysmic event, such as a deadly contagious disease that can only be stopped by eliminating the carriers of the disease. In this case, from a moral objectivist position, there is an argument to be made that genocide could be the most moral option, though not a good option. To be very clear, I cannot imagine this ever happening, and there would have to be some very extreme circumstances that are nigh impossible to occur. I've played several video games like Knights of the Old Republic, where I as the character had to make a decision to execute people with a disease or let them run free to infect others. Depending on my choice, the future in the game is affected. However, this circumstance would show when what one would think is a moral absolute could be more of a gray area than we originally think. The emphasis in moral objectivism is generally on finding alternative, less harmful solutions to ethical dilemmas like this. So, I would put forth that while extremely unlikely, there are potential situations where it could be more moral to take what we would consider an immoral action under the idea of moral absolutes.
You know, the Bible claims to be the Word of God, so it makes sense that Christians should look to it for guidance in all areas of their life. Starting from that belief, of course, the Bible then becomes like a compass. It's a way of navigating through life, giving them a way of thinking.
That presupposes a lot more than just the surface claim here. For the sake of this argument, let's assume the absolute truth of its contents. It does not necessarily follow that one should look to the Bible for guidance in all areas of life. Here are just a handful of reasons why. The Bible was written in a specific cultural and historical context that is vastly different from the modern world. Some of its teachings and directives may not be directly applicable or relevant to contemporary issues and challenges. Attempting to apply ancient laws and customs to modern life can lead to misunderstandings and potentially harmful outcomes. Societies and moral values have evolved over time, and what was considered morally acceptable in biblical times may no longer align with contemporary ethical standards. For example, the Bible contains passages that seem to endorse practices such as slavery and the subjugation of women, which are widely rejected today. Adhering to such outdated norms would conflict with the principles of justice and equality that many hold dear. The Bible's account of the natural world often differs from contemporary scientific understanding. Relying solely on biblical descriptions in areas like cosmology, biology, or geology may hinder scientific progress and the pursuit of knowledge. The Bible is subject to interpretation, and there are numerous denominations and theological perspectives within Christianity, each with its own interpretation of certain passages. This diversity of interpretation can lead to conflicting guidance, making it challenging to determine a single universally applicable set of principles. Finally, individuals have unique life circumstances and experiences that may require nuanced and context-specific guidance. While the Bible can offer generally moral and ethical principles, it may not address the complexities of individual situations adequately. Even if we assume the absolute truth of the Bible and the existence of God as depicted within it, it is still important to approach the Bible with a discerning and critical perspective. It may offer valuable moral and ethical insights for some, but it should be considered alongside other sources of wisdom, contemporary knowledge, and individual judgment to navigate the complexities of modern life effectively. Blindly following the Bible in all areas of life without critical reflection could lead to moral, ethical, and practical challenges in our diverse and evolving world.
And God has revealed certain rules that apply to all people throughout time. Don't murder, do not steal, don't commit adultery, sex outside of marriage, etc.
I've already mentioned that these could all be considered the moral thing to do in certain circumstances. I am sure you can come up with situations where stealing could be the right thing to do. As for sex outside of marriage specifically, I want to get just a bit personal for a moment. I am not married. I am, however, recently out as ace. Because of this, I've had to do a lot of thinking about the idea of adultery. Is the act of adultery immoral? If so, why? The problem people typically have with adultery is that it is some form of cheating. If this is the case, then yes, I can see the problem. However, if it is not cheating, then what is the issue? Cheating is a violation of the boundaries set up in a relationship. If everyone in the relationship agrees it's okay, then I don't see the harm necessarily. Of course, I'm going to guess that I will need to touch on this later, but based on his last sentence, I think Calvin is purporting that adultery is wrong because God says so. Let's see.
So these are referred to as moral absolutes. Now, a consistent atheist, of course, is forced to believe that there are no absolutes. Why? Well, because they've got to believe in some type of self-creation or evolution.
Wow, he says a lot here in just a few words. Let me take a moment to talk about this. This, at absolute best, is a misunderstanding of atheism. Atheism, at its core, is a lack of belief in gods or deities. It does not inherently prescribe belief in self-creation or any particular metaphysical stance. Atheists can hold a wide range of philosophical views, including moral realism, which posits that objective moral facts exist independently of deities. Belief in or rejection of moral absolutes is not contingent upon one's stance of the existence of gods. Many atheists ground their moral values in secular ethics, reason, empathy, and social consensus rather than relying on divine authority or self-creation, thus demonstrating that atheism does not necessitate a rejection of moral absolutes. Hopefully I don't have to repeat myself on this point, but I think it may be important. I think that Calvin, like many apologists, thinks that because he thinks that moral absolutes exist, and also that moral absolutes necessarily come from his God, that his God must exist. So if his God doesn't exist, where do these moral absolutes come from? There are multiple fallacies in this logic. First, it is a false dichotomy. It suggests that there are only two possible options. Either moral absolutes come from God, or they don't exist at all if God doesn't exist. This overlooks alternative explanations for the existence of moral absolutes. It assumes that if God doesn't exist, then moral absolutes have no source or explanation, which is an oversimplified and limited view of ethical theories. As I stated before, many ethical systems and philosophical perspectives propose alternative sources for moral principles that do not rely on the existence of a deity. So, the fallacy is the failure to consider and address alternative explanations for the existence of moral absolutes, assuming an either-or scenario when more nuanced possibilities exist. Next, It is an argument from ignorance. The assumption is that if God doesn't exist, then there must be no other possible explanation for moral absolutes. This is essentially saying, I don't know of any other source for moral absolutes, so God must be the only explanation. It assumes that the absence of an alternative explanation implies the truth of the proposed explanation, God. It can also be an argument from personal incredulity. In this case, the argument seems to stem from the speaker's inability to comprehend how moral absolutes could exist without God. This personal incredulity leads to the conclusion that God must be the only possible source without considering alternative viewpoints or explanations.
Which means everything was generated randomly. There's no intelligence behind it.
I am not going to go into evolution and its terrible misunderstanding of it. Let's just move on.
So logically, if every person's mind is a result of a random chance process over time, there isn't even a reason to trust logic or reason or anyone's opinion anyway.
I really wasn't going to go into this, but now I kinda have to. Firstly, the claim misrepresents the process of natural selection and evolution. While biological evolution involves elements of chance, it is a cumulative, selective process that shapes traits beneficial for survival and adaptation, including cognitive abilities like logic and reason. Secondly, the argument falsely assumes that trust in logic and reason must be grounded in some ultimate transcendent source. In reality, trust in these faculties is justified by their consistent track record in helping us understand and navigate the world successfully. Logic and reason are tools developed by humans to make sense of their environment, and their reliability is demonstrated through empirical evidence and practical application. We trust them because they have been proven to be effective, not because they rely on a specific origin. Thus, the idea that the absence of a predetermined purpose or divine source undermines our trust in reason and logic is unfounded and contradicted by the very effectiveness of these cognitive tools in our daily lives. Alright, I need to get this idea off my chest. I've heard this a lot, and I haven't heard it discussed very often, and when I have, not in great detail. The argument put forth that if there is no God, then we have no reason to trust logic, reason, or anyone's opinion is an asinine one. If you argue that we cannot rely on logic, reason, or opinions due to an inherent distrust of cognitive processes or sources of knowledge, then you should apply that same skepticism to any belief, including beliefs in God or any other absolute source. If you're skeptical of one's ability to discern truth or make reliable judgments, you should be equally skeptical of all claims, religious or otherwise. Presuppositionalists often argue that atheists use circular reasoning to try to prove that their senses are giving them correct information. We use our senses to prove our senses. While this may not be entirely wrong, it isn't a problem either. Using our senses to justify our sensory data is not inherently circular reasoning. It becomes circular reasoning when it forms an unbroken loop without external validation, or when it relies solely on itself to establish its own validity. Here's a breakdown. It is circular reasoning when we use our senses to perceive the external world. We conclude that our senses are reliable because they provide sensory data. Therefore, our senses are reliable because they provide sensory data. This is circular reasoning because it doesn't offer an external or independent basis for validating the reliability of our senses. It essentially uses the conclusion, our senses are reliable, as its own premise. Not circular reasoning. We use our senses, sight, touch, etc., to perceive the external world. We gather sensory data through these perceptions. We analyze and interpret this data using reason and cognitive faculties. We draw conclusions and form beliefs based on the processed sensory data. This process is not circular because it involves multiple steps, including sensory perception, cognitive processing, and their use of reason to draw conclusions. It doesn't solely rely on the senses to validate themselves. When someone claims that using our senses to justify our sensory data is circular reasoning, they're likely pointing to cases where the argument follows the circular pattern as described in the first example. However, not all uses of sensory perception to interpret the external world are circular in nature. The key distinction is whether the argument relies solely on the senses to validate themselves, or if it involves multiple steps and external validation through empirical evidence, reason, or other means. This could be an equivocation fallacy, though accusing someone of committing an equivocation fallacy would depend on how they're using the term circular reasoning and whether they're misrepresenting the nature of the argument. It is the religious person who relies on their senses to determine the existence of a God who grounds their senses. This is a circular argument. This type of argument forms a self-referential loop. It looks something like this. The religious person uses their senses, e.g. seeing, hearing, feeling, to perceive the world, which includes their religious experiences, texts, and teachings. Based on these sensory experiences, they conclude that a God or divine entity exists. They further argue that this God or divine entity is the foundation or source of their senses. The circularity arises because the argument relies on the existence of a God to explain the reliability of their senses, which in turn were used to establish the existence of that very God. It doesn't provide an independent, non-circular justification for the belief in their God. This argument doesn't offer empirical evidence or external validation for the existence of God. Rather, it relies on the assumption of God's existence to account for the reliability of sensory experiences. Thank you for letting me vent a bit. Now let's continue.
If there's no God, there are no standards. Then each person has the right to decide for themselves about right and wrong. And this means no absolutes.
See, I knew I'd have to cover that.
So, are there absolutes or aren't there?
There aren't. Even with a God, simply because an authority figure says something is morally correct doesn't make it a moral absolute. This is shown by just changing what you think the God's position on murder is. If God said the murder is moral, then would it be moral? This leads to the Euthyphro dilemma. Is it moral because God said so, or does God say so because it's moral? To try to avoid actually answering this question, the apologist often says moral principles are grounded in God's nature or the character of God. This is what is called modified divine command theory. Rather than going into this, I can make an entire video talking about it if there's interest. This is already getting to be pretty long, and I'm not even a quarter of the way through the video.
This is a big question because if there are, then there must be a lawgiver, a creator of them.
This is not necessarily the case. Even granting that moral absolutes exist, I've already given alternatives.
If there isn't a creator, then we aren't bound to absolutes.
This statement reflects a particular philosophical perspective known as moral relativism. This perspective posits that without a divine or transcendent source, moral values and absolutes are not binding or objectively grounded, but are instead contingent on human beliefs, cultural norms, or subjective judgments. Not all ethical frameworks agree with this view. As I mentioned before, various ethical theories propose alternative foundations for moral values and absolutes, such as moral realism, which asserts that moral facts exist independently of human beliefs or a creator.
For example, is raping and killing a child wrong? Most would say yes. But that would mean there are absolutes. It's absolutely true that for a human to rape and kill a child is always wrong. A consistent atheist would be forced to say something like, well, I personally believe it's wrong. But logically, they'd have to admit that the murderer has a right to believe whatever they want to, which means it's right for the murderer, so they can't actually be wrong.
I've already talked about the concept here. However, I do agree that a murderer has the right to believe what they want to. Calvin tries to paint this as a black and white idea, thus committing the fallacy of the same name. It isn't moral absolutes exist, or no one can criticize a murderer for thinking that it's okay to murder. Moral criticism can still be meaningful and valid even in the absence of moral absolutes. Individuals can evaluate actions based on their own moral values, societal norms, ethical principles, and reasoned judgment. In other words, people can make moral judgments and criticize actions by referencing their personal or collective ethical frameworks.
You see, some atheists say that you can believe whatever you want as long as you don't hurt someone else. But is that true? Is it absolutely true?
This idea of absolute truth apologists like to try to push as a way to try to disprove some sort of argument about what is or isn't true is pretty frustrating. Absolute truth is typically associated with principles that hold true without exception, such as mathematical or logical truths. So likely no. The statement, one can believe whatever they want as long as they don't hurt anyone else, reflects a moral or ethical principle rather than an absolute truth in the traditional sense. It represents a value judgment or a personal belief about how individuals should be free to hold their own beliefs and opinions as long as those beliefs do not cause harm to others. It is based on subjective ethical values, emphasizing personal autonomy and the avoidance of harm. Ethical principles often depend on specific contexts and circumstances. What constitutes harm and what actions are considered acceptable or unacceptable can vary depending on the situation and the cultural or societal norms in place. This idea aligns with the idea of moral pluralism, which acknowledges the diversity of moral perspectives and values in society. It allows for the coexistence of differing ethical beliefs and respects individual autonomy.
If it's true, then there are absolutes. It's absolutely true that no one should ever hurt someone else.
No, there are different kinds of truths besides absolute truth. Relative truth refers to statements or propositions that are true within a specific context or under certain conditions, but may not be universally applicable. For example, scientific theories are considered true within the scope of the evidence and the testing available, but may be subject to revision or refinement as new information emerges. It could potentially be a subjective truth too. Subjective truth is based on personal beliefs, opinions, or perspectives. While something may be considered true for an individual or a particular group, it may not be true for others who hold different viewpoints. These truths are subjective and may not have universal validity. There are also provisional truths. This concept acknowledges that our understanding of truth can evolve over time as new evidence or insight becomes available. What is considered true today may be subject to revision or refinement in the future as our knowledge advances.
Which means this statement actually argues against a belief in no absolutes. Now, when someone says something that, if true, means it's false, it's called a self-refuting argument. It can't possibly be true. And this type of argument literally self-destructs. We've all heard these types of statements. I mean, think of a couple of them here. How about, well, you can't know anything for sure. Well, how do you know that for sure?
This is a bit tricky. On the surface, he is correct. This is a self-refuting statement. However, this is only the case if taken at face value in an absolute sense. It could be seen as a reflection of general skepticism about human knowledge, acknowledging that our understanding of the world is always subject to revision and improvement without making absolute claims about certainty or uncertainty. In the context of philosophical or epistemological discussion, the statement might be used to provoke thought and engage in a dialogue about the limits of human knowledge, the nature of certainty, and the challenges of skepticism. It can serve as a starting point for exploring these complex topics. The statement could be seen as emphasizing that while absolute certainty may be elusive, there are degrees of certainty and confidence in our beliefs and knowledge. It encourages a recognition that our beliefs and knowledge claims vary in terms of their level of certainty. In these contexts, the statement may not be seen as self-defeating, but rather a way to stimulate philosophical inquiry, or as a reminder of the inherent complexities and limitations of human knowledge. If there are only absolutes, then yes, it is a self-refuting statement, but I'm not willing to ignore the nuance.
Talking about God is meaningless. Then your statement itself is meaningless.
I don't think talking about God is meaningless. Calvin, once again, is only correct on the very surface, if that. Talking about God is meaningless is a statement about the meaningfulness of discussion or discourse related to God or theological matters. It addresses the topic of discussion rather than the content of the discussion. So when Calvin states, then your statement itself is meaningless, it is highlighting that the initial statement is making a claim about discussions involving God, and as such cannot be considered meaningless in the same context. Instead, it is expressing a perspective on the meaningfulness of those discussions. In this case, the self-referential critique may not apply as effectively because the initial statement was addressing the meaningfulness of discussions about God, not discussing God itself. It underscores the importance of clarifying the context and scope of statements when evaluating their meaning and coherence.
Well, there's no such thing as truth. Is that a true statement? There are no absolutes. Are you absolutely sure that there are no absolutes? Well, no one can know, for sure any truth about religion. Then how do you know that truth about religion?
These all suffer the same issues I just brought up. The statement, no one can know for sure any truth about religion, is kind of a meta-claim or meta-statement that addresses the nature of certainty of religious knowledge itself. It is a statement about the limits of religious knowledge. The response, then how do you know that truth about religion, is a challenge to the claimant's own certainty or knowledge about the limits of religious knowledge. It points out what appears to be a contradiction. The claimant is asserting a certain knowledge about the uncertainty or unknowability of religious truths. So the response focuses on the meta level of the claim, questioning the claimant's own epistemic stance or level of certainty regarding religious knowledge, while the initial statement addresses the nature of religious knowledge as a whole. It highlights the complex and self-referential nature of discussions about knowledge, belief, and religious truth.
You see the point here? Science is the only sure method of finding truth. Well, what specific scientific experiment taught you that truth?
This has a similar issue, so I won't delve too deeply into this. I don't believe science is the only method for finding truth, and I think this is likely being a bit hyperbolic. The claim, science is the only method for finding truth, is a philosophical or epistemological statement about the reliability of scientific methodology in obtaining knowledge. It's not necessarily derived from a specific scientific experiment. It is a conclusion drawn from philosophical reasoning and the history of science. It's based on an assessment of the empirical success, methodological rigor, and self-correcting nature of scientific inquiry. While the claim itself isn't the result of a specific scientific experiment, it aligns with the empirical evidence that scientific methods have consistently provided valuable and reliable insights into the natural world. I suggest that the claim doesn't necessarily exclude other valuable methods for pursuing truth and knowledge. Instead, it asserts the primary role of science in understanding the natural world.
You can even people are saying things like, well, you can only know truth through experience, but what experience would have taught you that? Some people like to avoid the concept of absolutes because they believe it leads to intolerance and makes people judgmental. For example, many people Times people will be offended when a Christian states their views on certain subjects based on what the Bible teaches. Like, someone might take offense if a Christian disagrees with same-sex marriage, for example.
The question then comes to, why do you think this could be considered offensive? Opposition to same-sex marriage is often a form of discrimination against LGBTQIA+ individuals, as it can deny them equal rights and societal acceptance. Such opposition can be seen as contributing to a climate of inequality and exclusion. Disagreements on this issue can perpetuate stigmatization and harm to LGBTQIA+ individuals, affecting their mental and emotional well-being. It can also lead to social prejudice and exclusion. When religious beliefs are used to oppose civil rights measures like same-sex marriage, it can create tension between religious freedom and the principle of equal protection under the law. Some may find this offensive as it appears to prioritize religious doctrine over the rights of the LGBTQIA+ individuals. Those are just 3 very brief reasons, though I don't think Calvin is actually arguing this just yet, so we should just continue.
God doesn't agree with it, the Christian might say. Well, a typical response might be something like, well, that's the problem with Christians. They're always judging other people's morals and values. Well, when they did that, they also judged the Christians' morals and values. Some people might want to say, well, it's okay to judge as long as you don't try to force your morality and opinions on other people. Well, it's easy to point out that if that's their morality and opinion, why are they trying to force it on other people? See, there's virtually no way to be a consistent moral relativist. I've seen people argue that there's no clear-cut right and wrong passionately one minute, and then talk about how unfair it was that the person at work got a raise and they didn't the next minute.
Again, Calvin sets this up as if either there are moral absolutes or everything is relative. This is not the case by far. Here's a short list of other types of ethics that are not moral absolutist or moral relativism. This is just a very short list of potential alternatives in ethics. If this interests you, take a basic ethics course at your local college, or just spend an afternoon on Wikipedia just reading on these different ideas.
Well, how do they suddenly know that that's wrong? You see, someone saying that there's no God and no rules shouldn't say that anyone else's opinions are wrong, including Christians whose opinions they don't agree with.
I don't know anyone who says there are no rules in an absolute sense. At a minimum, we as a society agree to follow certain rules in order to have a functioning society. In every ethical framework, there is some sort of guidelines, even if the rules are less rigid than your absolutist viewpoint. Again, Calvin is asserting this black and white thinking. Rarely is anything black and white, especially in something as complicated as ethics and morality.
So, are there moral absolutes?
No.
Yes.
No, there aren't.
God made rules in the world He created, and everyone seems to recognize that when they're being treated unfairly.
Disagreeing with what one person thinks is fair does not mean that there is an absolute standard that everyone knows or must follow. And that's it for his video. There is a lot here, so let me try to break down the main points in this video. Do moral absolutes exist? The Bible is a moral compass to help Christians navigate life. There are moral absolutes like do not murder, do not steal, and no sex outside of marriage. A consistent atheist is forced to believe in moral absolutes because they typically embrace concepts like evolution, which are devoid of inherent intelligence. Without God, individuals have the right to decide for themselves about right and wrong. If there are moral absolutes, there must be a lawgiver or creator of those absolutes. One cannot be a moral relativist while simultaneously holding moral judgments or opinions. Moral absolutes exist, and people recognize them when they feel they're being treated unfairly. That's all for this one. What did you think? Do you think Calvin made some good points and maybe moral absolutes exist? Or do you think he's being too black and white and missing a lot of nuance? Let me know in the comments below. I think that he made a lot of leaps in judgment and failed to account for a lot of other options that he hasn't considered, either because he doesn't know them or he intentionally avoided them to make his point. If you hit the like button, is that a demonstration that people like this video? Or is counting the likes to see how many people like this circular reasoning? Though one could make the argument that by hitting the subscribe button, if you haven't already, it would be a demonstration of relative enjoyment of my channel. Absolute thanks to my patrons, Longhaired Lefty, Musical Ocelot, Jammin' Bomb, and Kai Henningsen, who are the moral standards for which my channel is judged. If you'd like to be the moral compass to find the truth, you can join them for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/DarkOfAllTrades. My next patron exclusive should be up within the next week or so patrons be on the lookout for that. Or for a relative thanks, you can hit super thanks and get your comment read on the next video. All of your support means the world to me. You are all wonderful just the way you are. And as always, keep learning.